America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at The True Believer by Eric Hoffer. This book was originally published in 1951. I've got the 1966 paperback edition. It's not a long book. Clocks in at 140 something pages, 151 pages, minus the notes. Well, my copy unfortunately is beginning to fall apart, but these little paperbacks will only last so long. I'm sure this has been read many times. Yikes. Anyhow, this is a book about mass movements, and it's kind of an overview about how mass movements are formed, what sort of people constitute them. It's interesting. It's an interesting book, and honestly, it's an interesting book from the perspective of utilizing mass movements to advance your agenda. I'm not sure that's his intention. Maybe it's also to undermine, could be used to undermine mass movements, to find ways to weaken their impact. But really, to understand them gives you the tools to steer them in your desired direction. Like all my episodes, I'm going to read a couple sections, and we can see what we think about what he has to say. He's got a few sections where he describes the different types of people that you might find participating in mass movements, and I'm going to read a couple of those, but there is one other section I want to read first. I want to jump into chapter 3, where he talks about the interchangeability of mass movements, and gives a bit of a description, a little bit of a description about the main thrusts of mass movements. Here in this section he says, quote, "Since all mass movements draw their adherents from the same types of humanity and appeal to the same types of mind, it follows, A, all mass movements are competitive, and the gain of one in adherents is the loss of all the others. B, all mass movements are interchangeable. One mass movement readily transforms itself into another. A religious movement may develop into a social revolution or a nationalist movement. A social revolution into militant nationalism or a religious movement. A nationalist movement into a social revolution or a religious movement. It is rare for a mass movement to be wholly of one character. Usually it displays some facets of other types of movement, and sometimes it is 2 or 3 movements in one. The exodus of the Hebrews from Egypt was a slave revolt, a religious movement, and a nationalist movement. The militant nationalism of the Japanese is essentially religious. The French Revolution was a new religion. It had its dogma, the sacred principles of the revolution, liberty and holy equality. It had its form of worship and adaptation of Catholic ceremonial, which was elaborated in connection with civic holidays. It had its saints, the heroes and martyrs of liberty. At the same time, the French Revolution was also a nationalist movement. The Legislative Assembly decreed in 1792 that altars should be raised everywhere bearing the inscription, "The citizen is born, lives, and dies for the homeland." The religious movements of the Reformation had a revolutionary aspect, which expressed itself in peasant uprisings and were also nationalist movements. Said Luther, "In the eyes of the Italians, we Germans are merely low Teutonic swine. They exploit us like charlatans and suck the country to the marrow. Wake up, Germany!" The religious character of the Bolshevik and Nazi revolutions is generally recognized. The hammer and sickle and the swastika are in a class with the cross. The ceremonial of their parades is as the ceremonial of a religious procession. They have articles of faith, saints, martyrs, and holy sepulchres. The Bolshevik and Nazi revolutions are also full-blown nationalist movements. The Nazi revolution had been so from the beginning, while the nationalism of the Bolsheviks was a late development. Zionism is a nationalist movement and a social revolution. To the Orthodox Jew, it is also a religious movement. Irish nationalism has a deep religious tinge. The present mass movements in Asia are both nationalist and revolutionary. The problem of stopping a mass movement is often a matter of substituting one movement for another. A social revolution can be stopped by promoting a religious or nationalist movement. Thus, in countries where Catholicism has recaptured its mass movement spirit, it counteracts the spread of communism. In Japan, it was nationalism that canalized all movements of social protest. In our South, the movement of racial solidarity acts as a preventative of social upheaval. A similar situation may be observed among the French in Canada and the Boers in South Africa. This method of stopping one movement by substituting another for it is not always without danger, and it does not usually come cheap. It is well for those who hug the present and want to preserve it as it is not to play with mass movements, for it always fares ill with the present when a genuine mass movement is on the march. In pre-war Italy and Germany, practical businessmen acted in an entirely logical manner when they encouraged a fascist and a Nazi movement in order to stop communism. But in doing so, these practical and logical people promoted their own liquidation. There are other safer substitutes for a mass movement. In general, any arrangement which either discourages atomistic individualism, or facilitates self-forgetting, or offers chances for action and new beginnings, tends to counteract the rise and spread of mass movements. These subjects are dealt with in later chapters. Here, we shall touch upon one curious substitute for mass movements, namely migration. Emigration offers some of the things the frustrated hope to find when they join a mass movement, namely change and a chance for a new beginning. The same types who swell the ranks of a rising mass movement are also likely to avail themselves of a chance to emigrate. Thus, migration can serve as a substitute for a mass movement. It is plausible, for instance, that the United States and the British Empire welcomed mass migration from Europe after the First World War. There might have been neither a fascist nor a Nazi revolution. In this country, free and easy migration over a vast continent contributed to our social stability. However, because of the quality of their human material, mass migrations are fertile ground for the rise of genuine mass movements. It is sometimes difficult to tell where a mass migration ends and a mass movement begins, and which came first. The migration of the Hebrews from Egypt developed into a religious and nationalist movement. The migrations of the barbarians in the declining days of the Roman Empire were more than mere shifts of population. The indications are that the barbarians were relatively few in number, but once they invaded a country, they were joined by the oppressed and dissatisfied in all walks of life. It was a social revolution started and masked by a superficial foreign conquest. Every mass movement is, in a sense, a migration, a movement toward a promised land. And when feasible and expedient, an actual migration takes place. This happened in the case of the Puritans, Anabaptists, Mormons, Doukhobors, and Zionists. Migration, in the mass, strengthens the spirit and unity of a movement, and whether in the form of foreign conquest, crusade, pilgrimage, or settlement of new land, it is practiced by most active mass movements. End quote. So that's an early section, and I really think it's pretty good. So there seems to be three major types of mass movements that he talks about here. Those are nationalist, social revolutions, and religious movements. And he says that oftentimes there's more than one. A movement will have traits of multiple of these three. And he gives a lot of examples. And he says most of these movements share at least two qualities. And in preventing a mass movement, it's often a feasible practice to substitute another mass movement in its place. Something else that can stand in for that and attract the sort of people and the sort of social energy that would go into the other mass movement that you don't want, and channel that into the mass movement that you do want. But he also says you're playing with fire when you're playing with mass movements. You can't always control them. They can spread like wildfires. And if you like things the way they are, if you're happy with the status quo, don't mess around with mass movements, because mass movements have a tendency toward upheaval. And he says that emigration is also something that is tied in often with mass movements. And in this respect, he's talking about people leaving, not people arriving. That if you have a country that has a lot of active, pent-up social energy, that has a lot of discontents in its population that might be prone to social revolution, you can encourage them to scoot along to somewhere else if you can arrange a place for them to go to, or you've got something in mind where they can go somewhere else. They can take that pent-up social revolutionary energy along with them. You don't necessarily want to contend with it. He says, when he's talking about emigration, he says emigration offers some of the things the frustrated hope to find when they join a mass movement, namely change and a chance for a new beginning. Migration can serve as a substitute for a mass movement. He says it's plausible that if the United States and the British Empire had welcomed mass migration from Europe after the First World War, there might have never been a fascist nor a Nazi revolution. I don't know how true that is, but maybe if we had taken people in after World War I, I'm not sure that I don't know enough history to know that whether there was a pressing demand for places to go after World War I. But regardless, the idea here is that emigration can kind of act as a means of frustrating a mass movement, dispersing the people who would otherwise make up the membership of the mass movement. But he says that migration and mass movements are often wrapped up, so even if they go somewhere else, they're just as prone to have their own mass movement as a large group of migrants, like the early Jews leaving Egypt. They've got a nationalist aspect, they've got a religious aspect, they've got these mass movement features as a group of migrants. And mass migration and mass movements get mixed up together. So now, moving on from there, he begins to talk about the potential people who could constitute the membership of mass movements, and he talks about the undesirables. And he says, quote, "There is a tendency to judge a race, a nation, or any distinct group by its least worthy members. Though manifestly unfair, this tendency has some justification, for the character and destiny of a group are often determined by its inferior elements. The inert mass of a nation, for instance, is in its middle section. The decent, average people who do the nation's work in cities and on the land are worked upon and shaped by minorities at both ends, the best and the worst. The superior individual, whether in politics, literature, science, commerce, or industry, plays a large role in shaping a nation. But so do individuals at the other extreme, the failures, misfits, outcasts, criminals, and all those who have lost their footing, or never had one, in the ranks of respectable humanity. The game of history is usually played by the best and the worst, over the heads of the majority in the middle. The reason that the inferior elements of a nation can exert a marked influence on its course is that they are wholly without reverence toward the present. They see their lives and the present as spoiled, beyond remedy, and they are ready to waste and wreck both, hence their recklessness and their will to chaos and anarchy. They also crave to dissolve their spoiled, meaningless selves in some soul-stirring, spectacular communal undertaking, hence their proclivity for united action. Thus, they are among the early recruits of revolutions, mass migrations, and of religious, racial, and chauvinist movements, and they imprint their mark upon these upheavals and movements which shape a nation's character and history. The discarded and rejected are often the raw material of a nation's future. The stone the builders reject becomes the cornerstone of a new world. The nation without dregs and malcontents is orderly, decent, peaceful, and pleasant, but perhaps without the seed of things to come. It was not the irony of history that the undesired in the countries of Europe should have crossed an ocean to build a new world on this continent. Only they could do it. End quote. So that's interesting. He talks about the undesirables, and he talks about how civilization and society and history, let's say, history and the shape of a nation over the course of time are driven by the two ends of the spectrum of capacity. The exceptionally successful and gifted and superior of a people, the leaders, the most intelligent and most capable of a people, drive a civilization, but it is also driven by the people at the bottom, the dregs, the rejected, the criminals, and the misfits, because they don't value the present, they don't value the moment, and they don't want to preserve things. They think that things might be better somehow if they were different, and they visualize themselves taking part in meaningful social changes rather than just poor and pathetic lives. And so they dedicate themselves to mass movements, and they often have a major impact on society. Interesting. So moving on to describe in more detail some of the figures that one finds in mass movements, let us begin with the misfits. He says, quote, "The frustration of misfits can vary in intensity. There are, first, the temporary misfits, people who have not found their place in life but still hope to find it. Adolescent youth, unemployed college graduates, veterans, new immigrants, and the like are of this category. They are restless, dissatisfied, and haunted by the fear that their best years will be wasted before they reach their goal. They are receptive to the preaching of a proselytizing movement, and yet do not always make staunch converts, for they are not irrevocably estranged from the self. They do not see it as irremediably spoiled. It is easy for them to conceive an autonomous existence that is purposeful and hopeful. The slightest evidence of progress and success reconciles them with the world and themselves. The role of veterans in the rise of mass movements has been touched upon in Section 35. A prolonged war by national armies is likely to be followed by a period of social unrest for victors and vanquished alike. The reason is neither the unleashing of passions and the taste of violence during wartime, nor the loss of faith in a social order that could not prevent so enormous and meaningless a waste of life and wealth. It is rather due to the prolonged break in the civilian routine of the millions enrolled in the national armies. The returning soldiers find it difficult to recapture the rhythm of their pre-war lives. The readjustment to peace and home is slow and painful, and the country is flooded with temporary misfits. Thus it seems that the passage from war to peace is more critical for an established order than the passage from peace to war. The permanent misfits are those who, because of a lack of talent or some irreparable defect in body or mind, cannot do the one thing for which their whole being craves. No achievement, however spectacular, in other fields can give them a sense of fulfillment. Whatever they undertake becomes a passionate pursuit, but they never arrive, never pause. They demonstrate the fact that we can never have enough of that which we really do not want, and that we run fastest and farthest when we run from ourselves. The permanent misfits can find salvation only in a complete separation from the self, and they usually find it by losing themselves in the compact collectivity of a mass movement. By renouncing individual will, judgment, and ambition, and dedicating all their power to the service of an eternal cause, they are at last lifted off the endless treadmill which can never lead them to fulfillment. The most incurably frustrated, and therefore the most vehement, among the permanent misfits are those with an unfulfilled craving for creative work, both those who try to write, paint, compose, etc., and fail decisively, and those who, after tasting the elation of creativeness, feel a drying up of the creative flow within, and know that never again will they produce aught worthwhile, are alike in the grip of a desperate passion. Neither fame, nor power, nor riches, nor even monumental achievements in other fields can still their hunger. Even the wholehearted dedication to a holy cause does not always cure them. Their unappeased hunger persists, and they are likely to become the most violent extremists in the service of their holy cause. End quote. So that's a strange and interesting section. He talks about two different kinds of misfits, the permanent misfits and the temporary misfits. And the temporary misfits really kind of sounds like many people that we would consider to be sort of misfits in our world. Rebellious teenagers, veterans having a hard time fitting back into civil society, and new immigrants, unemployed college graduates, people who aren't quite fitting into society. But then he talks about another type, the permanent misfit. And oddly, he almost says like the permanent misfit has nothing to do with how well they might seem to fit in. They could be successful, but they feel a perpetual sense of disconnect with the world because they're hungering for something, and they know they can never achieve it. They know they can never have their hunger satisfied. And oftentimes the type of people you find in this group are failed artists and failed creative types who may even be successful, but they know perhaps deep down inside that they can never produce the creative genius that they dream of producing, or that they'll never be able to create again what they once created. This sort of frustrated artist type is like the true permanent misfit. And these are the people who dedicate themselves wholeheartedly to the mass movements. He says their unappeased hunger persists, and they are likely to become the most violent extremists in the service of their holy cause. Interesting. Let's look at the next section when he talks about the bored. He says, quote, "There is perhaps no more reliable indicator of a society's ripeness for a mass movement than the prevalence of unrelieved boredom. In almost all the descriptions of the periods preceding the rise of mass movements, there is reference to vast ennui, and in their earliest stages, mass movements are more likely to find sympathizers and support among the bored than among the exploited and oppressed. To a deliberate fomenter of mass upheavals, the report that people are bored stiff should be at least as encouraging as that they are suffering from intolerable economic or political abuses. When people are bored, it is primarily with their own selves that they are bored. The consciousness of a barren, meaningless existence is the main fountainhead of boredom. People who are not conscious of their individual separateness, as is the case with those who are members of a compact tribe, church, party, etc., are not accessible to boredom. The differentiated individual is free of boredom only when he is engaged either in creative work or some absorbing occupation, or when he is wholly engrossed in the struggle for existence. Pleasure chasing and dissipation are ineffective palliatives. Where people live autonomous lives and are not badly off, yet are without abilities or opportunities for creative work or useful action, there is no telling to what desperate and fantastic shifts they might resort in order to give meaning and purpose to their lives. Boredom accounts for the almost invariable presence of spinsters and middle-aged women at the birth of mass movements. Even in the case of Islam and the Nazi movement, which frowned upon feminine activity outside the home, we find women of a certain type playing an important role in the early stage of their development. Marriage has, for women, many equivalents of joining a mass movement. It offers them a new purpose in life, a new future, and a new identity, a new name. The boredom of spinsters, and of women who can no longer find joy and fulfillment in marriage, stems from an awareness of a barren, spoiled life. By embracing a holy cause and dedicating their energies and substance to its advancement, they find a new life, full of purpose and meaning. Hitler made full use of the society ladies thirsting for adventure, sick of their empty lives, no longer getting a kick out of love affairs. He was financed by the wives of some of the great industrialists, long before their husbands had heard of them. Miriam Beard tells of a similar role played by bored wives of businessmen before the French Revolution. They were devastated with boredom and given to fits of the vapors. Restlessly, they applauded innovators. End quote. So there you have the bored, and these seem to be a large portion of early adopters. They're not going to lead the mass movement. They're not going to initiate the mass movement. But when it comes along, they're going to latch onto it fairly early because they have no excitement in their lives. They have nothing interesting them. And again, he brings it back to creativity. People who want to but cannot seem to express their creativity. He says, where people live autonomous lives and are not badly off, yet are without abilities or opportunities for creative work or useful action, there's no telling what desperate and fantastic shifts they might resort. So he also talks about spinsters and middle-aged women. Spinsters meaning unmarried women. Unmarried women and middle-aged women who are bored. He says marriage is a substitute for mass movements because it provides a source of joy and fulfillment, but they find as they approach middle age and they're unmarried, they find a sort of meaningless, and they seek out a holy cause to dedicate themselves to. Interesting. I think we see that with modern leftist movements. So moving on from there, we begin to discuss the fanatics. And in this section, he says, quote, when the moment is ripe, only the fanatic can hatch a genuine mass movement. Without him, the disaffection engendered by militant men of words remains undirected and can vent itself only in pointless and easily suppressed disorders. Without him, the initiated reforms, even when drastic, leave the old way of life unchanged. And any change in government usually amounts to no more than a transfer of power from one set of men of action to another. Without him, there can perhaps be no new beginning. When the old order begins to fall apart, many of the vociferous men of words who prayed so long for the day are in a funk. The first glimpse of the face of anarchy frightens them out of their wits. They forget all they said about the poor simple folk and run for help to strong men of action, princes, generals, administrators, bankers, landowners, who know how to deal with the rabble and how to stem the tide of chaos. Not so the fanatic. Chaos is his element. When the old order begins to crack, he wades in with all his might and recklessness to blow the whole hated present to high heaven. He glories in the sight of a world coming to a sudden end. To hell with reforms. All that already exists is rubbish, and there is no sense in reforming rubbish. He justifies his will to anarchy with the plausible assertion that there can be no new beginning as long as the old clutters the landscape. He shoves aside the frightened men of words. If they are still around, though he continues to extol their doctrines and mouth their slogans. He alone knows the innermost craving of the masses in action, the craving for communion, for the mustering of the host, for the dissolution of cursed individuality in the majesty and grandeur of the mighty whole. Posterity is king, and woe to those, inside and outside the movement, who hug and hang on to the present. Whence come the fanatics? Mostly from the ranks of the non-creative men of words. The most significant division between men of words is between those who can find fulfillment in creative work and those who cannot. The creative man of words, no matter how bitterly he may criticize and deride the existing order, is actually attached to the present. His passion is to reform, and not to destroy. When the mass movement remains wholly in his keeping, he turns it into a mild affair. The reforms he initiates are of the surface, and life flows on without a sudden break. But such a development is possible only when the anarchic action of the masses does not come into play, either because the old order abdicates without a struggle, or because the man of words allies himself with strong men of action the moment chaos threatens to break loose. When the struggle with the old order is bitter and chaotic, and victory can be won only by utmost unity and self-sacrifice, the creative man of words is usually shoved aside, and the management of affairs falls into the hands of the non-creative men of words, the eternal misfits, and the fanatical condemners of the present. The man who wants to write a great book, paint a great picture, create an architectural masterpiece, become a great scientist, and knows that never in all eternity will he be able to realize this, his innermost desire, can find no peace in a stable social order, old or new. He sees his life as irrevocably spoiled, and the world perpetually out of joint. He feels at home only in a state of chaos. Even when he submits to or imposes an iron discipline, he is but submitting to or shaping the indispensable instrument for attaining a state of eternal flux, eternal becoming. Only when engaged in change does he have a sense of freedom and the feeling that he is growing and developing. It is because he can never be reconciled with his self that he fears finality and a fixed order of things. Marat, Robespierre, Lenin, Mussolini, and Hitler are outstanding examples of fanatics, arriving from the ranks of non-creative men of words. Peter Weyrich points out that most of the Nazi bigwigs had artistic and literary ambitions which they could not realize. Hitler tried painting and architecture, Goebbels, drama, and the novel and poetry, Rosenberg, architecture and philosophy, von Schirach, poetry, funk, music, Streicher, painting. Almost all were failures, not only by the usual vulgar criterion of success, but by their own artistic criteria. Their artistic and literary ambitions were originally far deeper than political ambitions, and were integral parts of their personalities. The creative man of words is ill at ease in the atmosphere of an active movement. He feels that its whirl and passion sap his creative energies. So long as he is conscious of the creative flow within him, he will not find fulfillment in leading millions and in winning victories. The result is that once the movement starts rolling, he either retires voluntarily or is pushed aside. Moreover, since the genuine man of words can never wholeheartedly and for long suppress his critical faculty, he is inevitably cast in the role of the heretic. Thus, unless the creative man of words stifles the newborn movement by allying himself with practical men of action, or unless he dies at the right moment, he is likely to end up either a shunned recluse or in exile or facing a firing squad. End quote. So that was a rather longish section about the fanatic. And he says basically that when it comes down to it, only the fanatic can kick things off. Most people are going to settle for reform of some sort. Ordinary men of words who critique the old order but really don't want the old order to change. They really like themselves in the position of the person who's critiquing the ongoing old order. They'll happily do that for the rest of their lives. They'll be the crank, the voice who's criticizing things. But there's a certain other type of fanatic who will not do that. And it's hard to kind of grasp exactly what he's saying here. But there's a certain fanatical type that will not accept anything but chaos. And this sort of person, he says, whence come the fanatics? Mostly from the ranks of the non-creative men of words. So here you have people who wish that they were creative people. He comes back a lot, you may have noticed in this book, to like frustrated creativity as being a major factor in mass movements. And that's interesting. He kind of comes back a lot. And this seems as though that's really where it all kicks off from, is someone who wants to live a creative life, be a painter, be a writer, be something creative, and they find that they're not successful at it. They're not as good at it maybe as they would like to be. They can't say what they're trying to say through their creative effort. And it seems as though he's saying that The person who wants to write a great book or paint a great picture or etc., etc., he says this, and when this person knows that they will never be able to realize it, they'll never be able to do it, they have a dream for some creative project they'll never be able to achieve, this person can find no peace in a stable social order. This person it seems to me that it's almost, he says that fame and stuff won't satisfy the desire. Maybe that's true, but I wonder to what extent it's people looking to be known more so than they want to create something. They want the world to know their name. And they know that they won't be able to do it through their creative project because the world doesn't understand them. The world doesn't understand their creative project. That they might even believe that their creative project is great, but the rest of the world doesn't get it, or something like that. They want to leave a name for themselves, and so they become fanatics. I don't know, that doesn't seem to be what he's saying, but I wonder whether that's a part of it. But he basically says, like, if you look at leaders of these mass movements, whether they are nationalist or communist, these guys are failed creatives, failed writers, failed painters, failed novelists, failed poets. Interesting. Yeah, he says the creative man of words doesn't really fit in with the total revolution. If you're a truly talented creative person, you might not necessarily fit in with the complete revolution or the dedicated mass movement, because there's a amount of individuality that has to be suppressed in the mass movement, and maybe the truly creative type isn't really into that. Anyway, there's one more section that I want to read, and that is this about the practical men of action. He says, quote, "A movement is pioneered by men of words, materialized by fanatics, and consolidated by men of action. It is usually an advantage to a movement, and perhaps a prerequisite for its endurance, that these roles should be played by different men succeeding each other as conditions require. When the same person or persons, or the same type of person, leads a movement from its inception to maturity, it usually ends in disaster. The fascist and Nazi movements were without a successive change in leadership, and both ended in disaster. It was Hitler's fanaticism, his inability to settle down and play the role of practical man of action, which brought ruin to his movement. Had Hitler died in the middle 1930s, there is little doubt that a man of action of the type of Göring would have succeeded to the leadership, and the movement would have survived. There is, of course, the possibility of a change in character. A man of words might change into a genuine fanatic, or into a practical man of action. Yet the evidence points that such metamorphoses are usually temporary, and that sooner or later there is a reversion to the original type. Trotsky was essentially a man of words, vain, brilliant, and an individualist to the core. The cataclysmic collapse of an empire and Lenin's overpowering will brought him into the camp of the fanatics. In the Civil War, he displayed unequaled talents as an organizer in general, but the moment the strain relaxed at the end of the Civil War, he was a man of words again, without ruthlessness and dark suspicions, putting his trust in words rather than in relentless force, and allowed himself to be pushed aside by the crafty fanatic Stalin. Stalin himself was a combination of fanatic and man of action, with the fanatical tinge predominating. His disastrous blunders, the senseless liquidation of the kulaks and their offspring, the terror of the purges, the pact with Hitler, the clumsy meddling with the creative work of writers, artists, and scientists, were the blunders of a fanatic. There was small chance for the Russians to taste the joys of the present while Stalin the fanatic was in power. Hitler was, too, primarily a fanatic, and his fanaticism vitiated his remarkable achievements as a man of action. There are, of course, rare leaders, such as Lincoln, Gandhi, even FDR, Churchill, and Nehru. They do not hesitate to harness man's hungers and fears to weld a following and make it zealous unto death in the service of a holy cause, but unlike a Hitler, a Stalin, or even a Luther and a Calvin, they are not tempted to use the slime of frustrated souls as mortar in the building of a new world. The self-confidence of these rare leaders is derived from and blended with their faith in humanity, for they know that no one can be honorable unless he honors mankind. The man of action saves the moment from the suicidal dissensions and the recklessness of the fanatics, but his appearance usually marks the end of the dynamic phase of the movement. The war with the present is over. The genuine man of action is intent not on renovating the world, but on possessing it, whereas the life breath of the dynamic phase was protest and a desire for drastic change. The final phase is chiefly preoccupied with administering and perpetuating the power won. With the appearance of the man of action, the explosive vigor of the movement is embalmed and sealed in sanctified institutions. A religious movement crystallizes in a hierarchy and a ritual. A revolutionary movement in organs of vigilance and administration. A nationalist movement in governmental and patriotic institutions. The establishment of a church marks the end of the revivalist spirit. The organs of a triumphant revolution liquidate the revolutionary mentality and technique. The governmental institutions of a new or revived nation put an end to chauvinistic belligerence. The institutions freeze a pattern of united action. The members of the institutionalized collective body are expected to act as one man, yet they must recognize a loose aggregation rather than a spontaneous coalescence. They must be unified only through their unquestioning loyalty to the institutions. Spontaneity is suspect, and duty is prized above devotion. The chief preoccupation of a man of action, when he takes over an arrived movement, is to fix and perpetuate its unity and readiness for self-sacrifice. His ideal is a compact, invincible whole that functions automatically. To achieve this, he cannot rely on enthusiasm, for enthusiasm is ephemeral. Persuasion, too, is unpredictable. He inclines, therefore, to rely mainly on drill and coercion. He finds the assertion that all men are cowards less debatable than that all men are fools, and in the words of Sir John Maynard, inclines to found the new order on the necks of people rather than in their hearts. The genuine man of action is not a man of faith, but a man of law. Still, he cannot help being awed by the tremendous achievements of faith and spontaneity in the early days of the movement, when a mighty instrument of power was conjured out of the void. The memory of it is still extremely vivid. He takes, therefore, great care to preserve in the new institutions an impressive facade of faith, and maintains an incessant flow of fervent propaganda, though he relies mainly on the persuasiveness of force. His orders are worded in pious vocabulary, and the old formulas and slogans are continually on his lips. The symbols of faith are carried high and given reverence. The men of words and the fanatics of the early period are canonized, though the steel fingers of coercion make themselves felt everywhere, and great emphasis is placed on mechanical drill. The pious phrases and the fervent propaganda give to coercion a semblance of persuasion, and to habit a semblance of spontaneity. No effort is spared to present the new order as the glorious consummation of the hopes and struggles of the early days. The man of action is eclectic in the methods he uses to endow the new order with stability and permanence. He borrows from near and far, and from friend and foe. He even goes back to the old order, which preceded the movement, and appropriates from it many techniques of stability, thus unintentionally establishing continuity with the past. The institution of an absolute dictator, which is characteristic of this stage, is as much the deliberate employment of a device as the manifestation of a sheer hunger for power. Byzantinism is likely to be conspicuous, both at the birth and the decline of an organization. It is the expression of a desire for a stable pattern, and it can be used either to give shape to the as yet amorphous, or to hold together that which seems to be falling apart. The infallibility of the Bishop of Rome was propounded by Irenaeus, 2nd century, in the earliest days of the papacy, and by Pius IX in 1870, when the papacy seemed to be on the brink of extinction. Thus, the order evolved by a man of action is a patchwork Stalin's Russia was a patchwork of Bolshevism, Tsarism, nationalism, pan-Slavism, dictatorship, and borrowings from Hitler and monopolistic capitalism. Hitler's Third Reich was a conglomerate of nationalism, racialism, Prussianism, dictatorship, and borrowings from fascism, Bolshevism, Shintoism, Catholicism, and the ancient Hebrews. Christianity, too, when after the conflicts and dissensions of the first few centuries it crystallized into an authoritarian church, was a patchwork of old and new, and of borrowings from friend and foe. It patterned its hierarchy after the bureaucracy of the Roman Empire, adopted portions of the antique ritual, developed the institution of an absolute leader, and used every means to absorb all existent elements of life and power. In the hands of a man of action, the mass movement ceases to be a refuge from the agonies and burdens of an individual existence and becomes a means of self-realization for the ambitious. The irresistible attraction which the movement now exerts on those preoccupied with their individual careers is a clear-cut indication of the drastic change in its character and of its reconciliation with the present. It is also clear that the influx of these career men accelerates the transformation of the movement into an enterprise. Hitler, who had a clear vision of the whole course of a movement, even while he was nursing his infant National Socialism, warned that a movement retains its vigor only so long as it can offer nothing in the present, only honor and fame in the eyes of posterity, and that when it is invaded by those who want to make the most of the present, the mission of such a movement is done for. The movement, at this stage, still concerns itself with the frustrated, not to harness their discontent in a deadly struggle with the present, but to reconcile them with it, to make them patient and meek. To them it offers the distant hope, the dream, and the vision. Thus, at the end of its vigorous span, the movement is an instrument of power for the successful and an opiate for the frustrated. End quote. So there you have the men of action. And now you're talking about like when a movement has been realized, when it has been successful in its initial aims. First come the men of words, the creative men of words, who don't really want to upset the apple cart, but who like to talk about it. They come first. The fanatic comes along, who takes those writings seriously and says, actually, we need some serious action, perhaps violent action, perhaps overthrow, perhaps violent nationalism or violent religious movement, aggression. Who the fanatic is the one who materializes it in such a way, whether it be violence or otherwise, in such a way as to overthrow the existing order. The fanatic is the one who means business, takes all of the creatives, scribblers and scrawlers' words seriously. And again, you can find people that have a mix and match. They're a little bit the men of words and a little bit the fanatics, but they always kind of revert to type. But the fanatics can't keep the movement going. Once the movement overturns the old order, it has to establish itself. And that's where the men of action come from. And the men of action are kind of piecemeal, gathering whatever seems to work, whatever seems to do the trick. The men of action are using to assemble something that is going to in some ways resemble the old order and in some ways resemble the new order. And the original fanatics and the original thinkers, creatives, will be enshrined as the great heroes of the movement. They'll be revered, but they will perhaps be pushed aside, and their ways will no longer be like the ways of the present. The revolutionary spirit of the whole thing has to be suppressed in order for the new order to take hold and calcify and solidify into the way things are done now. And so there's a change of the guard, and without the change of the guard, without the succession of different types of people leading the movement at different stages in its life cycle, the movement will fail. And he talks about how had Hitler sort of died in the 30s after taking power, and someone else who was more practical come along and not made the various fanatical blunders that Hitler made, like the mass killings and the military unnecessary military engagements. The Nazi movement may have lived much longer, may have succeeded and lived into the future. But Hitler was a fanatic, and without him giving up control to someone a little more practical minded, the Nazi movement was destined for destruction. So that's pretty interesting stuff here. Definitely a lot of things to think about when it comes to mass movements. It's interesting how he says once people begin to look to the movement for their own self-interest, you know that its heady days are over, because it is now wields institutional power. When the movement wields institutional power and people recite the slogans for their own personal gain in order to position themselves into the institutions and in order to get their hands on the levers of power, at that point it is no longer a vibrant mass movement. It is now a sequence of institutions. It has already long been in the hands of men of action and no longer has that early fire given to it by the fanatics and the early creative types who laid the foundation. So thanks for listening, and I will catch you again next time. Goodbye.